He was the most debauched king in Korean history, King Yeonsan. To satisfy his desires, he often used hunting as an excuse to seize women. The local people, even if they saw it, dared not speak out, but in Yeonsan's eyes, this was already a great favor to the commoners. After venting his lust, Yeonsan would race horses with his half-brother, who posed a threat to the throne. One day, a few hawks suddenly appeared, which Yeonsan mistook for assassins, and he fell off his horse. From then on, he developed an incurable mental illness. Corrupt officials saw their chance to grow stronger. Together with his father's trusted men, they presented Yeonsan with the clothes worn by his mother before her death. When Yeonsan learned that his biological mother had been poisoned, he unleashed a bloody purge in the palace. He smashed the skulls of 2 of his father's concubines with a flail, then rammed his head against a wall and killed his own grandmother. He tortured officials who had slandered his mother with brutal punishments such as stone crushing, poison, and dismemberment. Even his father's remains were dug up, desecrated, and fed to pigs. This made the notorious Sahong rise in favor, becoming Yeonsan's close confidant. But to solidify his power, Sahong had to place his own people in the harem. The first obstacle was Jang Naksu, once a concubine of the late king, now treated by Yeonsan like a wet nurse. Sahong flattered Yeonsan, persuading him that life is short and should be enjoyed to the fullest. So Yeonsan ordered Sahong and his son to act as rainbow envoys, tasked with scouring the land for beautiful women to bring into the palace. Sahong seized the opportunity, kidnapping maidens from commoners' homes and even abducting wives and daughters of officials who opposed him. But none of the women pleased him. To rival Jang Naksu's influence, he needed someone truly special. His sights turned to a wealthy man in Yangju, whose daughter was rumored to be a great beauty. He gave the father one day to prepare her. But on the way back, Sahong was captivated by a street performance. The girl dancing had jet black eyes like a peacock, a high nose, and lips like carved jade. Sahong realized she was the perfect candidate. Unfortunately, she was the daughter of a butcher, a status that barred her from the palace. Yet her dance gestures reminded him of his childhood sweetheart. To confirm her identity, Sahong followed her into an alley, only to be ambushed by thugs. They attempted to rob him, and he quickly fell into danger. Just as he was about to be killed, the girl fought back fiercely. One thug raised a stick to strike her, but Sahong shielded her with his body, taking the blow. The girl carried the unconscious man back to her home and discovered the envoy's badge on him. Realizing his purpose, she made a bold request. Sahong hesitated, conflicted, but the next day, when he came to collect the wealthy man's daughter, he found the girl had replaced her. Determined to enter the palace, she forced his hand. On the road back, some of Sahong's men attempted to violate her, but Sahong intervened in time, preserving her dignity. Both had saved each other once, and a subtle bond began to form. The next day, all the abducted girls were sent to the palace. Yeonsan, overjoyed at the sight of so many beauties, ordered them to be taken to a school to learn how to serve him. The scholar in charge refused, unwilling to let women taint the place of learning. But Yeonsan's authority could not be defied, and the school was transformed into a training ground for concubines. The selection process was cruel. Those who could not please him were eliminated, while girls found to be pure were stamped and kept for advancement. To make Dan-hee, the butcher's daughter, Sahong gave her special training tailored to Yeonsan's tastes. But in the next round of tests, she was suddenly outshone by Seol Youngming, a famous courtesan from Busan. To seize control of the harem, Jang Naksu brought Seol Youngmei into the palace and subjected her to harsh training, preparing her to overshadow the women that Sahong had gathered. One day, Yeonsan decided to test the girls' progress. He ordered them each to eat something from the table and describe its taste. Many thought the clever choice would be to select something strange or unpleasant to amuse the king, but nothing surprised him until Seol Youngmei stepped forward. She picked the most revolting dish and ate it with exaggerated gestures of charm, instantly capturing Yeonsan's attention. Seeing this, Dan-hee refused to be outdone. She deliberately chose the most bitter, unpalatable food and forced herself to eat it. Yeonsan, astonished that anyone could endure it, came to her side and asked for her thoughts. Her response was clever, layered with wit, and it stirred something deep in Yeonsan's memory, reminding him of his long-lost mother. Overcome with emotion, he wanted to take Danhee into the palace immediately, but Sahong advised patience. He argued that she needed stricter training first if she was truly to serve the king. Though reluctant, Janssen agreed. Hoping to help Danhee win Janssen's heart, Sahong gave her a treasured sword, telling her to perform the same dance she had once done on the streets. But as he watched her graceful movements, he was struck by a sudden realization. Her gestures reminded him of his childhood sweetheart, a girl he had thought lost forever. Years earlier, when her father wrote a rebellious poem, Sahong's own father had urged the king to execute him, removing a rival. Yet Sahong had never stopped believing that his childhood companion might still be alive. Now, with Danhee before him, he was convinced she was the same girl. At that moment, Janssen himself appeared, catching Sahong as he watched too intently. Danhee's dancing inflamed the king's desire, and he could no longer contain himself. Seo Youngmei, unwilling to let Danhee steal the spotlight, decided to take a dangerous risk to win Janssen's favor. She used her seductive skills to captivate him, and soon the two women were set against each other in a contest for dominance. Jang Nok-soo, determined to give Seo Youngmei the advantage, devised a scheme. She disguised a nobleman as Janssen and had the girls perform before him. Whoever could arouse him the most would be granted the first chance to perform for the king. Seo Youngmei, being a seasoned courtesan, knew every trick to please men. Within moments, the nobleman was completely bewitched, and even Sahong, watching from the side, could not help but stare. When it was Danhee's turn, Jang Nok-soo secretly conspired to humiliate her. She ordered that jars of strong liquor be brought in. For every cup the nobleman failed to finish, Danhee had to remove a piece of clothing. If she was naked before he became drunk, she would be forced to serve him that night. Realizing the trap, Danhee acted decisively. She suddenly struck him, shattering his dignity and exposing him to ridicule. Furious, the nobleman raised his hand to slap her, but Sahong stepped in and stopped him. The nobleman lost face, and to him, Danhee's defiance was unforgivable. Determined to ruin her, the nobleman traveled to Yangju to investigate Danhee's background. There, he discovered her true identity, the daughter of a butcher. He rushed back to inform Sahong's father, who feared that if this truth reached Janssen, their entire position at court could be threatened. To protect his power, he resolved to silence Danhee permanently. At last, the day of the grand performance arrived. Seo Youngmei opened the show in a striking red gown, her sultry dance stirring Janssen's excitement. Danhee followed, entering with a sword in hand like a warrior maiden. The cold fire in her eyes held the king spellbound. Just as Sahong thought she had captured Janssen completely, he noticed his father signaling secretly. Following his gaze, he saw what made his blood run cold. An archer had already taken aim at Danhee. Sahong's father never expected that his own son would risk his life for a woman. But the assassination attempt also provided a perfect excuse to explain things to Janssen. Father and son quickly shifted the blame onto other officials at court, claiming they had plotted the attack out of jealousy, fearing that others might monopolize the king's favor. With Sahong's persuasion, Janssen began a massive purge of the court. Any official not aligned with the Sahong family was arrested. Even the daughters they had sent into the palace as potential consorts were implicated, poisoned, or cast aside. Yet Sahong himself had another motive. He wanted to protect Danhee by removing her from the palace. He already knew her true purpose. She had entered not to serve, but to assassinate Janssen and avenge her father's death. But fate turned cruel. The very next day, Janssen resumed his brutal games. He held noblemen's daughters in his arms, teaching them to shoot arrows by using condemned prisoners as targets. To the girl's horror, when the hood was pulled from one prisoner, she recognized her own father as the man she was ordered to kill. The women trembled in fear, but Janssen only grew more excited, reveling in their despair. Surrounded by concubines, he forced them into degrading displays, all while executing scholars and nobles with arrows. One woman, unable to bear it, seized a sword and pointed it at Janssen. It seemed she intended to die with him, but instead she took her own life before his eyes. Enraged, Janssen roared, seeing her death as an ill omen. Sahong, sensing the king's shifting mood, ordered archers to slaughter all the remaining prisoners, ending the spectacle. To protect both his beloved and his career, he later drafted a decree banishing Dan He and Seol Young-mei from the palace. But Seol Young-mei refused to give up her chance at changing her fate. She sought out the prince, revealing Dan He's true mission to assassinate Yonsun. The prince, realizing this could destabilize Sahong's family, secretly brought both women back to the palace, planning a final showdown. The winner would serve Yonsun, the loser would lose her head. Sahong dreaded the thought of Dan He losing to Seol Young. Before the contest, he trained her in endurance and discipline. Yet Yonsun's tests were perverse, pushing the women to their limits. In the end, it was Dan He who triumphed. Yonsun, delighted, drew his sword to behead Seol Young-mei, but Dan He shielded her with her own body. Far from angering him, this act amused Yonsun, and he laughed wildly. He declared Dan He his first-ranked consort and demoted Seol Young-mei to serve as her maid. Sahong knew what that meant. If Dan He attempted her assassination and failed, she would surely die, and her failure could drag him down as well. Desperate, he knelt before Yonsun, begging the king to grant Dan He to him instead. But Yonsun sneered. What he had not yet tasted, he would never let another man enjoy. Realizing that pleas would not work, Sahong took another gamble. On the night of the ceremony, he secretly diverted Dan He's palanquin to the riverside, urging her to flee and never return. But when the curtains opened, it was not Dan He who stepped out. It was Seol Young-mei. Sahong's worst fear had come true. He spurred his horse and raced toward the palace. But by then, Dan He had already entered Yonsun's private chambers. As the king prepared to indulge his lust, Dan He stopped him, declaring coldly that something needed to be settled first. When Yonsun tried to force himself on Dan He, she resisted. Her long legs blocked him, buying just enough time to reach for the dagger hidden behind the screen. But Yonsun suddenly realized something was wrong. There was someone waiting. From behind the screen emerged the prince, who had been hiding there all along, ready to intervene at the moment of Dan He's assassination attempt. The plot was exposed. Yonsun saw through the treachery of Sahong's father, who in desperation groveled at the king's feet, licking his shoes like a dog to prove his loyalty. To his son, Sahong, the sight was both bitter and shameful, so this was the ultimate fate of traitorous officials, to be reduced to a dog. Yonsun kicked Sahong's father aside and tossed a dagger to Sahong, ordering him to fetch Dan He's blood from the prison so that it could be used as ink for a painting. Sahong understood the king's true intent. He was being forced to kill the woman he loved. Instead, when the guards were absent, he secretly slipped her a family elixir to dull her senses, then carefully made a superficial wound on her abdomen, just enough to draw blood without endangering her life. In this way, he convinced Yonsun of his loyalty while sparing Dan He. He then arranged for Seol Young-mei to secretly carry Dan He's body out of the palace, ensuring her safety. With his beloved safe, Sahong resolved to overthrow Yonsun's tyranny once and for all. Disguised as the palace's rainbow envoy, he continued luring daughters of noble families while plotting rebellion with sympathetic ministers. Once the people's anger boiled over, they would rise together. One night, as Yonsun feasted and drank in the palace, Sahong approached, claiming he had completed his mission. He urged the king to wait until the following day for the women to be properly presented, but Yonsun, impatient and lustful, refused. That very night, under Sahong's scheme, Yonsun entered an empty chamber. Too late, he realized it was a trap. Sahong had weapons trained on him. Yonsun, desperate to survive, debased himself, even dancing like a fool. But Sahong's hatred could not be quenched. He poured a basin of pig's blood over Yonsun and unleashed pigs into the chamber to humiliate him further. Then he lit the signal. Outside, the rebel army stormed the city and broke into the palace. Amid the chaos, Dan He slipped back inside, determined to kill Yonsun herself. But in the throne room, it was Sahong who stood clad in the royal dragon robes, disguised as the king. He wished to die at Dan He's hand, ending his tormented life. Yet when Dan He raised her sword, she saw through the mask. Realizing it was Sahong, she could not strike. At that moment, Sahong's father struck from the shadows, aiming at Dan He. To stop him, Sahong turned his blade on his own father, mortally wounding him. In his final moments, The old man lashed out wildly, but the rebel soldiers arrived and shot him down. The palace erupted in flames, consuming both father and son. Thus ended Janssen's reign. He became the first king in Joseon to be overthrown by his people. 3 years later, at a marketplace, Seo Young-mei and a butcher were working when they spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. It was Danny. Exchanging a glance, the butcher removed his mask, revealing himself to be Sahong, who had miraculously survived. After all the trials and bloodshed, the two lovers were finally reunited.